On Christmas morning in 1893, the snow began to fall in the mountains of central Idaho. It was not an unusual storm for that country. The winter of 1893 had been one of the harshest in memory, and the settlers who had come to the gold fields of the Salmon River Mountains were accustomed to the brutal conditions that came with life at 6,000 feet. But this storm, and the silence that followed it, would become the foundation of one of the most enduring mysteries in American frontier history. The town was called Naughton. It was not a large settlement, perhaps 200 souls at its peak, clustered in a narrow valley where the creek ran cold and clear and the gold pans yielded enough color to keep the miners hopeful through the long winters. It had a general store, a saloon, a small schoolhouse, a hotel that served as the town's social center, and a population of men, women, and children who had come to the mountains seeking fortune and had found instead the hard work of survival. On Christmas Eve, the last travelers to leave Naughton reported that the town was alive with preparations for the holiday. A Christmas tree had been set up in the hotel lobby, decorated with strings of popcorn and bits of tinsel. The schoolchildren had been practicing their carols for weeks. The miners, most of them Irish and Cornish immigrants who had come to the American West by way of the Pennsylvania coalfields, had pooled their wages to buy presents for the few families in town. It was, by all accounts, the most festive Christmas the settlement had ever seen. By noon on Christmas Day, the storm had buried the trails leading into and out of the valley. The mail rider who was scheduled to arrive from the county seat never came, and the residents of Naughton settled in for what they expected would be a quiet holiday, their celebrations confined to the warmth of the hotel and the cabins that lined the frozen creek. They were never seen again. When the snow melted in the spring of 1894, the first travelers to venture into the valley found the town intact but utterly empty. The doors of the cabins stood open, the beds unmade, the remnants of Christmas feasts still on the tables. The hotel lobby was still decorated with pine boughs and tinsel. The schoolhouse had a half-written lesson on the blackboard, the chalk still resting in the tray where the teacher had left it. But not a single soul remained. The search parties that combed the valley in the weeks that followed found no trace of the residents. No bodies, no signs of a struggle, no indication of where they might have gone. The snow that had covered the ground for months had preserved the town in a state of suspended animation, a snapshot of a community that had simply ceased to be. What happened to the people of Naughton on Christmas Day, 1893? The answer, if it exists at all, lies buried in the mountains of Idaho, in the archives of the county courthouse, and in the memories of the families who have kept the story alive for more than a century. Before we continue with the story of the Christmas Day vanishing of Naughton, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. And tell us in the comments what state or city you're listening from tonight. To understand what happened in Naughton, you have to understand the world of the Idaho gold fields in the 1890s, a world of isolation, desperation, and the relentless pursuit of wealth in one of the most unforgiving landscapes in the American West. The Salmon River Mountains of central Idaho are a region of extraordinary beauty and extraordinary danger. The peaks rise to nearly 10,000 feet, their slopes covered in dense forests of pine and fir, their valleys cut by fast-flowing rivers that drain into the Salmon, the great river that winds its way through the heart of the state. The region was known to the Nez Perce and Shoshone peoples who had lived there for centuries as a place of abundant game and rich resources, but also as a place where the winter cold could kill a man in hours and the summer heat could desiccate him in days. The first white settlers came to the region in the 1860s, drawn by reports of gold discoveries along the Salmon River. The rush that followed brought thousands of miners to the remote mountains, and a string of boom towns sprang up along the river and its tributaries. Naughton was one of the smaller of these settlements, founded in 1879 by a prospector named Daniel O'Leary, who had worked the Comstock lode in Nevada before striking north. The town was named for a mining engineer from Boston who had invested in the early claims, though O'Leary himself never used the name, preferring to call it simply the camp. It was not a wealthy place. The gold in the region was disseminated, fine, and difficult to extract. The miners who worked the claims did so with hand tools and sluice boxes, processing the gravel a few tons at a time, hoping each pan would yield enough color to make the backbreaking labor worthwhile. The conditions in Naughton were harsh. The winters were long and brutal, with temperatures that could drop to 40 degrees below zero. The snow could fall for weeks at a time, burying the cabins up to their roofs and making travel between the scattered homesteads nearly impossible. The miners lived on a diet of beans, salt pork, and sourdough bread, and they drank whiskey that was cheap and plentiful. There were few women in town, and the social life revolved around the saloon and the hotel, where the men gathered to drink, gamble, and exchange stories. But the isolation was also a source of community strength. The people of Naughton depended on each other in ways that the residents of more settled communities could not understand. When a cabin burned, the neighbors rebuilt it. When a miner fell ill, the others shared their food and medicine. There were no doctors within 100 miles, and the only law was the occasional visit of a federal marshal passing through on his circuit. The world of Naughton was a world of precarious balance, where a single bad winter or a single run of bad luck could destroy everything the settlers had built. And in 1893, the balance tipped. Act 3, The People 2000 Hours 30:00. The people of Naughton were not the stuff of legend. They were ordinary men and women, most of them immigrants, who had come to the American West seeking a chance at a better life. Their names, for the most part, have been lost to history, preserved only in the fragmentary records of the county courthouse and the fading memories of their descendants. But there are a few whose stories have survived, and they offer a glimpse of the community that vanished on Christmas Day. Daniel O'Leary was the founder of the town, a man who had been prospecting for gold for 30 years and had never struck it rich. He was a widower, his wife having died of fever during a cholera outbreak in the Nevada camps. He had come to the Salmon River country in 1878, searching for a place where the gold was richer and the winters were milder. He found neither, but he stayed anyway, drawn by the beauty of the landscape and the loneliness of his own soul. The town's only permanent female resident was a woman named Margaret O'Brien, the wife of the hotel keeper. Margaret was a native of County Cork, Ireland, who had emigrated to America as a young woman. She had met her husband, John, in a boarding house in San Francisco, where they had both worked as cooks. They had come north to Idaho in 1885, hoping that the gold fields would offer them a chance to escape the drudgery of city life. They had built the Naughton Hotel with their own hands, and they had been running it for 8 years. The hotel was the center of the community, a 2-story structure that served as a boarding house, a restaurant, and a gathering place for the miners. Margaret cooked the meals, tending to the fire in the large kitchen stove and feeding the dozens of men who came in from the mines each day. John managed the bar and the accounts, a quiet man who spoke little but was known for his fairness. The community also included a few families with children. The schoolteacher was a young man named Thomas Hartley, who had studied at the University of Virginia before heading west to seek his fortune. Hartley had arrived in Naughton in 1892, drawn by a newspaper advertisement for a teacher who would be willing to work in a remote mining camp. He had been shocked by the poverty and isolation of the town, but he had stayed, finding a kind of purpose in teaching the children of the miners to read and write. The children of Naughton were the heart of the community, the symbol of hope that the hard work of the miners would lead to a better future. They were the ones who decorated the Christmas tree, who sang carols at the hotel, and who believed, with the unshakable optimism of childhood, that the gold rush would never end. And then, on Christmas Day, 1893, they all vanished. The events of Christmas Day, 1893, have been the subject of speculation for more than a century. The winter storm that isolated the valley was the catalyst, but the disappearance itself remains unexplained. The last confirmed sighting of any resident of Naughton was on the afternoon of December 24. A packer named Silas Brown, who was bringing supplies up from the county seat, stopped at the town on his way to a mining camp further up the valley. He later testified that the town was buzzing with activity, that the hotel was decorated for the holiday, and that the children were running through the streets, their cheeks red from the cold. He stayed for 2 hours, had a meal at the hotel, and left before the storm intensified. The storm hit that night. Brown later described the snowfall as the worst he had ever seen, a blizzard that lasted for 4 days and dumped more than 3 feet of snow on the valley. He was trapped in the camp where he had been heading, and he was not able to return to Naughton until the spring thaw. When he finally made his way back to the town on April 12, 1894, he found the valley silent and empty. The snow had receded, revealing the cabins and the hotel and the schoolhouse, all of them intact, all of them abandoned. The doors were open, and the wind was blowing through the empty rooms. Brown was a hardened man, a veteran of the frontier who had seen his share of death. But what he found in Naughton unsettled him in ways he never fully explained. In his written account of the discovery, he described the scene as if the Lord had reached down and taken them all at once, leaving the town to wait for the resurrection. The search party that followed Brown to the valley in the subsequent weeks was led by the county sheriff, who was himself a man of practical experience. He had investigated dozens of disappearances in the backcountry, had seen the remains of prospectors who had died of exposure, of avalanches, of attacks by wild animals. He had never seen anything like what he found in Naughton. The cabins were untouched. The beds were made. The Christmas tree in the hotel was still decorated, the tinsel glinting in the spring sunlight. There was a half-eaten meal on the table in the hotel kitchen, a meal that had been left to freeze and thaw and rot. The schoolhouse had a lesson half-written on the blackboard, the chalk still in the tray. The town was a mausoleum. The search party combed the valley for miles, examining every cabin, every mine shaft, every trail. They found no trace of the residents. Not a body, not a shred of clothing, not a footprint in the mud that could be attributed to the missing. The snow had preserved the town as if in a time capsule, and when it melted, it revealed only the mystery. There were theories, of course. Some thought the residents had been killed by an avalanche that had swept the valley clean, leaving no trace of its victims. Others suspected they had been victims of a massacre, attacked by bandits or hostile natives who had taken the bodies away to hide the evidence. Still others believed they had simply left, that they had seen a better opportunity elsewhere and had abandoned the town in search of a new life. But none of these theories fit the evidence. If there had been an avalanche, there would have been debris, the twisted wreckage of cabins and trees that the avalanche would have carried down the valley. There was none. If there had been a massacre, there would have been signs of a struggle, perhaps a few bodies left behind. There were none. And if the residents had left voluntarily, why would they have left everything behind? Why would they have abandoned their possessions, their Christmas preparations, their carefully decorated tree? The mystery of Naughton was deepened by the discovery, in the spring of 1894, of a note that had been left in the pulpit of the town's small church. The note was written in a careful hand, and it said simply, "We have gone to find the water. We will return." The note was dated Christmas Day, 1893. What did it mean? What water was the writer referring to? There was a creek that ran through the valley, a source of water for the town. It was not dry. It was not frozen. There was no reason for the residents of Naughton to leave their homes to find water. The note was a clue, but it was also a riddle. The investigation that followed the discovery of the empty town was one of the most extensive ever conducted in the history of Idaho Territory. The sheriff and his deputies spent weeks interviewing everyone who had known the residents, examining every piece of evidence, and searching every corner of the valley. They found nothing. Not a single body, not a single piece of clothing, not a single explanation for what had happened. The investigation was also hampered by a series of bureaucratic failures that would later be the subject of intense scrutiny. The county records that might have shed light on the town's history were destroyed in a fire at the county courthouse in 1910, a fire that also consumed the official records of the investigation. The sheriff's notes, which he had kept in a journal, were lost when his cabin burned down in 1904. What remains of the investigation are a few fragments, newspaper articles, and the recollections of witnesses who have long since died. These fragments paint a picture of a town that was in the grip of a crisis that the residents had tried to hide from the outside world. The crisis was water. The creek that ran through the valley was drying up. The miners, in their relentless search for gold, had diverted the water for their sluice boxes, had dredged the creek bed, and had poisoned the water with mercury and cyanide. The water that remained was undrinkable, contaminated with the toxic waste of the mining operations. The townspeople had been trying to solve the problem for years. They had dug new wells, had tried to find new sources of water in the surrounding hills. They had written letters to the county commissioners, had appealed to the territorial governor for help. None of their pleas had been answered. On Christmas Day, 1893, the water crisis came to a head. The creek dried up completely, leaving the town without a source of drinking water. The residents were desperate. They had no choice but to leave their homes, to venture into the mountains to find a new source of water. But where did they go? The search parties found no trace of them in the surrounding hills. They had vanished, as if into thin air. The mystery of Naughton was also complicated by the involvement of a man who had been seen in the valley in the weeks before the disappearance. He was a stranger, a tall man with a gray beard and a quiet manner. He had arrived in the town in late November, and he had asked many questions about the water situation. The sheriff had interviewed the stranger, but had been unable to identify him. He had given his name as William Grace, but he had no papers, no identification, and no clear reason for being in the valley. He had left town a few days before Christmas, and his subsequent fate was unknown. Was the stranger connected to the disappearance? Was he a government agent, a scientist investigating the water crisis? Or was he something else entirely, something that the residents of Naughton had tried to hide? The investigation never answered these questions. The case was closed in 1896, with the sheriff concluding that the residents had left voluntarily, had found better opportunities elsewhere, and had simply not bothered to inform anyone of their departure. The town was abandoned, and its history was forgotten. But the memories of Naughton persisted, passed down through the families of the miners who had lived there. The story of the Christmas Day vanishing became a legend, a tale told around campfires and in saloons, a reminder of the harshness of frontier life and the mysteries that still lay hidden in the mountains of the West. The story of Naughton did not end with the closing of the investigation. It continued, in ways that the sheriff and his deputies could not have imagined. In the decades that followed the disappearance, a series of events occurred that linked the fate of the town to the larger history of the American West. The water crisis that had driven the residents from their homes was a symptom of a broader problem, the degradation of the land by the relentless pursuit of mineral wealth. The miners who had poisoned the creek had done so not out of malice, but out of desperation, trapped in a cycle of poverty and extraction that they could not escape. The disappearance of the residents of Naughton was also part of a larger pattern, the erasure of communities that had been caught up in the boom and bust of the mining economy. The town was not the only settlement that had been abandoned in the years after the gold rush. The Salmon River Mountains were littered with the remains of similar towns, places that had been built with hope and abandoned with despair. The mystery of Naughton is also connected to the larger history of the American West, the expansion of the nation across the continent, and the dispossession of the native peoples who had lived there for centuries. The Nez Perce Shoshone had known the value of the land, had respected its limits, and had refused to exploit its resources for short-term gain. The settlers who followed them had done the opposite. The Christmas Day vanishing of Naughton was a tragedy, but it was also a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The people who had lived there had built a community in one of the most inhospitable places on the continent, and they had done so with courage and determination. They had been failed by the system that had promised them riches, and they had been forgotten by the nation that had sent them to the mountains. Today, the site of Naughton is a ghost town, its cabins crumbling into the earth, its history preserved only in fragments. The creek that once provided water for the town still runs through the valley, but it is now a silent stream, its waters clear and cold. The mystery of what happened to the people of Naughton on Christmas Day, 1893, remains unsolved. The note left in the church, the stranger in the valley, the drying up of the creek, all are clues that have never been fully explained. The disappearance of the residents is a question that will probably never be answered. What do you think of this story? Do you believe the residents of Naughton voluntarily abandoned their homes? Or was there something darker at play? Leave your comment below. We read every single one, ****. If this story has stayed with you, if you want more forgotten chapters of American history, subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell. And share this video with someone who needs to understand that the past is never really past, ****. We'll see you in the next one.